Now, as I hope you kind of know by now, this session is called Belonging, Bordering and Citizenship. And if that sounds pretty broad, that's because it kind of is. Belonging speaks to something affective, something a bit nebulous. Bordering speaks to the violent implementation of the border regime, and citizenship is a much contested and much venerated tool of that bordering regime, but also something that there is maybe space to contest and space to claim as well. So to try and unpick what we mean when we talk about belonging and citizenship, I'm delighted to welcome our star panel today, all of whom bring unique perspectives on these issues. Just going to start off with apologies from Jerome Bond, who's an immigration and asylum law paralegal who helps with the Windrush legal surgeries in the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today, last minute dropout, but sends his regards. But we do have Richard Ratcliffe over here. Give us a wave, Richard, come on. It's a tough crowd, you've got to get the vibe up. Thank you, there we go. So Richard Ratcliffe is the husband of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. He works as an accountant and lives in London and has been heading up the really inspirational Free Nazanin campaign. We also have with us today Dalia Gabriel. Dalia is a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics and an editor at Novara Media. You might recognise her from YouTube. We're also joined today by Saskia Papadakis. Saskia is a researcher at Royal Holloway University and an organiser with Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants. And finally, we're joined by Jagtar Singh. Jagtar Singh is the co-founder of the National Sikh Youth Federation and currently works as program director for the Khalistan Centre. His work centres on Sikh sovereignty and resistance. So, is everyone excited, by the way? Good. Now on to the fun stuff. So, just going to start off with a simple question. How should we, as socialists, as people on the left, relate to the concept of citizenship? How do we understand it? Is it or can it be possible? And is it or can it be useful? Dalia, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to see so many people and just to be together again. After such a long time apart. I did this job 2 years ago, and it's the world. We're in a different world. It feels, that was before the election. It was before the pandemic. It was glimmers of hope still flamed in our hearts. So I'm going to respond to this question in the context of climate migration and climate-related displacement. I'm interested in the kind of strategies that the movement has developed in order to essentially deal with the fact that so many people are currently and will be displaced by climate change and by the effects of climate breakdown. One of which is the essentially the use of citizenship, the use of passports, the use of refugee status as a way of dealing with this issue. And just to kind of plug at the beginning, there's a book that myself and one of my comrades, Harpreet Paul, worked on called Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal. And it includes contributions from people all around the world. And it goes through, topics of work, land, infrastructure, migration, debt, reparations, and that, thinking about a global Green New Deal in that context. There will be some copies that you can pick up for free or you can order for free at www.global-gnd.com. I have to plug it so that I can get my accommodation covered here. So that's my thing done. But also we're doing a podcast based on that, which will be out with Novara Media on the 14th of October. I'm going to say inshallah because it's a busy time. So take from that what you will. Essentially, what is climate displacement? What is climate-linked displacement? So climate-induced displacement is often driven by people not having the resources to adapt to the consequences of climate change. So this could look like evacuating in the wake of, extreme weather events, or it could be the kind of slow violence of climate breakdown that makes people's livelihoods and ways of subsisting untenable in the location that they currently are. So one of the chapters in the book, Todd Miller, who is an Arizona-based journalist, goes into the story of 16-year-old Juan de Leon Gutierrez, who died in a U.S. detention center coming from Guatemala, which is part of what is known as the Dry Corridor, which it sort of covers large swathes of Central America. And this is an area that is experiencing the brunt of both, long droughts and also torrential rain, which creates immense amounts of food insecurity and economic instability. So Juan was essentially planning on joining his brother in the US and was going to be sending remittances to his mother back in Guatemala. And Juan was essentially a victim of what is the militarization of the US's response to climate change, where quote, mass migration is seen as a security threat that requires a sort of brutal border regime to deal with it. And that border doesn't just exist around the US, it's actually externalized. So you'll have, US training, Mexican border forces to kind of stop, flow of people through Central America and through Mexico. So it's not just located in the US, it's a kind of logic and structure of way of structuring the border that is pushed out and globalized. So the proposal in a lot of both, movement and also kind of institutional and legal circles is to create a protected category of climate refugee, where these refugees would be given climate passports, which would enable them to cross borders with refugee status. So essentially, the market, especially when you consider the toxicity and the heavily politicized sort of antagonism towards migrants in this current moment across the world, the idea is that this climate passport would be a marker of innocence. It would be a marker of, you have been displaced by something that is not your fault. The issue here is that the definition is necessarily very narrow. Climate-related displacement is incredibly broad because you're not just, when we imagine in this kind of conception of a climate refugee, the imagination is often of, a small Pacific island that is going to go underwater, and so, people need to be rehomed. So the first legal climate refugees were the inhabitants of a collection of Pacific islands called Tuvalu, which is home to 11,000 people, and these islands are under immediate threat, essentially, of going underwater. So we imagine, an island goes underwater, an extreme weather event happens, and, that is the ultimate innocent form of migration. Whereas climate breakdown creates displacement through many indirect and slow means. It creates economic insecurity, it creates food insecurity, it makes the conditions in which people are living unsustainable. So the question here is, under this definition, would Juan be considered a climate refugee? No, even though he is displaced by the effects of climate change. How long do I have? 2 minutes. So many people who are displaced by climate-related effects will be considered economic migrants who are not innocent, they're not pure, they're coming to get things that don't belong to them. I was on Jeremy Vine recently, and I was with Angela Epstein, and we were talking about, what is called the migration crisis. And she said, I don't think these people are actually fleeing something serious, they're just coming here for a better life. So, there was this sense of how can we make sure that they are innocent and they're not just here to take things that don't belong to them. We know that actually a lot of the resources in this country actually do belong to the rest of the world in many ways. So there is a problem here with relying on these pathways to citizenship and relying on these legal categories as a way, or whether it is refugee or whether it is, a citizenship, in order to confer meaning and to confer dignity and rights, because then we are handing the state the ability to make that definition fit into what their sort of political economy. And so if we were to actually give passports to everyone who has been displaced because of climate change or in a way that is related to climate breakdown, that would essentially mean opening all the borders, and it would mean, the global north actually taking responsibility for the crisis. So I think that to expand the category to include, so I think that, this it relies on this system of proof, I will literally finish. The system of proof, the system of marking of innocence. And I think that the starting point can't be how do we reduce migration to manageable levels by manipulating legal definitions and contours around people's experiences, but rather how do we ensure everyone has a right to dignity during times of related crisis. I will stop there, but that is sort of what I sort of think of when I think of this question.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and we'll return to that, how that ties into kind of wider manipulations of the category of citizen and attempts at reforming it as well a little bit later. Saskia, your turn. How should we relate to the concept of citizenship, and is it or can it be positive or useful?
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for inviting me, Amar. So Amar, when he invited us, mentioned the Kruger report, and I didn't know what that was, and so I had a little read of it, and it's by, what did you call him? A reasonable conservative, and it's about like how we can use what we've learned during the pandemic to transform the country, and he's basically like, it's like Big Society 2.0, but he writes a lot about the idea of levelling up the country, and I'm going to say levelling up England in this because I didn't really get the sense that he was interested in anywhere else. The idea of levelling up England and like, what does that mean? And I am a big old nerdy geographer, so I thought, what? Thanks.
Cheer over there.
I thought, what is a spatial metaphor that he's getting at here? And how does one level up? Like, why leveling up specifically? So when you're leveling up a place, you have to take something from somewhere else in order to flatten out that surface. So you're bringing everyone up to a certain level, but you're not doing it by redistributing any resources. You're doing it by taking resources from somewhere else. And I think that this is a really interesting one. So I work on the North-South divide, and a lot of the report is about kind of how the sort of chaotic and deindustrialized North, which for some reason has had stubbornly low productivity over the past 40 years, not sure why, can be taught kind of how to function better socially by the South, which is, doing super well. And it made me think of, like, where does the country get its resources from? Why is England one of the richest countries in the world? Obviously, it's because of the accumulation of resources extracted and stolen from, the many colonial projects that have been going on over the past sort of 400 or 500 years. In Nadine El-Anani's book, Bordering Britain, she talks about how the 1971 Immigration Act onwards has created borders around the UK in which the category of citizen is defined as a way of retaining the spoils of empire within the British mainland. So when we think of levelling up, where are we getting the resources from? It's these stolen resources that people are being denied access to. And what you were saying, Dalia, about the kind of idea of like people who migrate just to have a better life. Obviously, the reason that the UK people want to come and live in the UK is because of that perception of it being a wealthy place, which it is, but obviously those resources are very poorly distributed. So another thing that happens when you level somewhere up by taking from somewhere else, and this has happened in England itself when people were dispossessed through enclosures and other mechanisms. During over a couple of hundred years, the fens were filled in. This sounds like a weirdly specific example, but when you fill in a place, when you reclaim quote-unquote land, you have to take land and soil and whatever from somewhere else and put it in there. And by doing so, you're destroying what's already there. You're filling in, not only causing huge amounts of environmental destruction, but it doesn't take into account the social formations and relationships that already exist in that place. And I thought it was very interesting that the first thing that Nadine, Doris, did on becoming Culture Secretary was to order for the demolition of the Doorman Long Tower in Middlesbrough, where we see in gentrification projects, it's all about having as high buildings as possible, having blocks of flats, but you're filling them with desirable people. Whereas, I don't know a lot about the politics of the Doorman Long Tower, but it was interesting that there are groups in Middlesbrough who are arguing it's a vital part of industrial history that is of cultural significance to the residents of Middlesbrough. The government's not interested in retaining that cultural history because unless you can fill a tall building with rich people, then it's not very interesting to the government. So even there, you can see how the politics of levelling up only apply to certain groups of people. As I say, this may sound quite tangential to the idea of citizenship, but I think it's really important to look at when these terms by the government get kind of bandied around, they're not, we know that they're not applying to everyone, and they're about projects of retaining resources in places that will vote Conservative, but particularly in places where people are already wealthy. So, all the examples that Kruger gives in his report, he starts off by saying, in Bradford in the 19th century, they had a cholera outbreak, and this is what some local vicar said or whatever. And the imagination that he's drawing on there is of back in the day when England was functioning as a great industrial society, and also harking back to an imagined whiter nation, where we know that Bradford in the 19th century would have been full of people from basically all over the place because it was a place where you could find employment. His second example is of his community and devisers saying the vicar here, basically started mutual aid by himself. And so it's already drawing on this kind of conservative imagination of this green and pleasant land. We can all mutually support each other so long as we keep the structures that keep wealth in the hands of the wealthy intact. I hope some of what I've said makes sense, but these are what I've been pondering on. Thank you. I'll pass it on.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll be talking a bit more about the Kruger report later. Those connections between kind of the local power dynamics and kind of who is considered worthy of government aid or who is considered worthy of preserving within the context of the colonial project, and how that filters through on a macro level to kind of policy and discourses around who qualifies as citizen. That's really, really interesting. We're going to get into that later. Shamsher Baji, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. When I think about citizenship, I think about it in kind of two ways. One is obviously about belonging, which is something that's always precarious. And the other kind of deeper aspect is sovereignty. So for me, citizenship and sovereignty can't coexist. Being from a people that are a sovereign people, in order for us to come here and claim citizenship, where we're from had to no longer exist. And the sovereignty that we claimed as being indigenous people of that land had to be erased and replaced with a British passport that gave us rights. And that essentially then gives us the category of which citizenship bestows is the category of the human. So when you're a citizen, you're a human. When you're not a citizen, then you're a non-human. Then you don't belong. Then you can die. You can suffer. None of your suffering is statistically valid, let alone being visible within public discourse. I'll give you an example. In America, a couple of years ago, there was this Sikh police officer, Amardeep Singh, and who was killed while he was doing a traffic stop. And his death was
Mic up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so his death was, celebrated in that cathedral of Americanness, the football stadium, and he was super visible, look, Sandeep Singh has arrived, he belongs in America, he's part of America, we're going to mourn his death. But at the same time, there was a young girl who died on her way into America in the desert in Mexico, Gurpreet Kaur. And the Sikh community didn't see her in the same way they saw Sandeep Singh because he was a productive, loyal member of American society. And the same way here, for us, citizenship is, it depends on our loyalty to the nation. And if we're not loyal, like you can see with Shamima Begum, then your citizenship is stripped away. Then you can be thrown somewhere in a place of non-belonging. You can become stateless, even though you're born here. She's born here just like me. So for me, I know my citizenship is precarious and it's dependent on that me proving my loyalty to England. So Sikhs here in the UK, when we're hyper-visible, you'll see statues of us being subservient to empire. You'll see statues of Sikhs serving in World War I and II, and Sikhs themselves will talk about it. Oh, look how loyal we are. We belong in Britain because we've proved our loyalty by fighting for Britain, fighting against fascism. But when we're hyper-invisibilized, it's that same militant body that's hyper-invisibilized. When we hold a rifle and we fight for empire, then we can have statues. But when we hold those same rifles and we fight for our own independence, our own sovereignty, then we're invisibilized as extremists, as religious fundamentalists, and they're erased from that category of citizenship. And our citizenship becomes subject to criminalization. Our movement becomes subject to criminalization. So for me, like, citizenship is a really alien concept because, like, my grandma had a passport from Britain, and before then we didn't really have passports. We lived, right? Like, we had a deeper connection with the land. We existed before empire existed, and before empire came and saw us and gave that category of being a human, being a citizen. So for me, like, citizenship is always, dependent on erasing your humanity in order to fixate you in this binary of the loyal citizen or the criminal, inherently violent category that, can be stripped out of, this idea of belonging. And that thing is, with belonging, we never really arrive, though. Even when we're loyal, like, my Britishness is always something that I have to prove, by speaking in a certain way, by acting in a certain way. And that can become very questionable very, very quickly. So for me, if I'm walking down the street in a predominantly white area, people will see me and they won't see a British citizen, even though, I don't identify with that term myself. For me, it's a very uncomfortable label that's been applied. I see myself almost like as a hostage because I don't want to be born in this country. But, where I'm from no longer exists, so I don't really have a choice. So for me, it's like we always have to prove our belonging. We always have to prove our loyalty, and it can be stripped away at a moment's notice, essentially. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raji. Pass the mic over. And actually, it kind of reminded me of the fact that, the history of the concept of citizenship as well, historically, has actually been tied to whether or not someone from that country has or would be able to fight for the national good, right? So historically, citizenship has been tied in with, like, state violence and complicity in state violence and kind of the carceral systems of justice, right? And again, later, there's a lot to talk about, but we will try and talk about that later too. Richard, over to you. How should we, or how would we relate to the category of citizen, the concept of citizenship? Can it be positive? Can it be useful?
Yeah, thank you, Juan, and thank you, all of the panelists. It's a really fascinating conversation, really stimulating, Shamshir, just there. I said to Amar, I kind of sit here as a pro-citizenship person on the table. For those, many of you may know me, but for those who don't, my name is Richard Ratcliffe. I'm the husband of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. She is being held hostage in Iran over British government debt. We've spent 5.5 years now pushing the government to sort of take responsibility and to take care and to protect her. And in that, I mean, a lot of what you say is resonant, but for me, pushing the government to have obligations of protecting its citizens is a really important sort of axiom, I suppose, of our campaign. It's been a discovery, I have to say, about the ways in which the government interprets and discharges that obligation, and probably a fairly big expectations gap from me as a middle-aged, middle-class accountant, and what they did and what they do. And it's probably fair to say, there are a number of British citizens sitting in prisons overseas, some fairly, some unfairly. There's, on average, about 100 British citizens a year being tortured. In the last 20 years, there has been one that a foreign minister has acknowledged as them being tortured by a foreign. That's Nazanin. So we get it pretty good in that sense, in that having been very vocal and very visible, we've got a lot of attention, which has resulted in response. I think for me, the point that we hold on to citizenship partly because of a way of getting the government to do something, but we have a long-running battle in Nazanin's story, which is, and it applies to everyone in this room that has a British passport. when you go overseas, there are consular rights. There are sort of the British government has a set of rights in terms of other countries and how it protects its citizens. You as a British citizen don't have any. The government has rights. So it's a state-to-state kind of relationship. The British government has complete discretion as to whether it chooses to protect you or not. And if you're visible or mouthy, and if you're from a certain class and so on, you've got more chance than if you're not. But the alternative in that between citizenship is actually being a subject. It's, the way, back in 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the way that the government would work on lots of levels. If you've got the right connections, you'll get things to move, and if you don't, you won't as much. And I think, we're in danger, I think, when we throw out, the baby with the bathwater, we're in danger of ending up with rich man's law. And actually something that you can see it in lots of levels and different sort of tiers of who gets services and so on, who gets protected and so on. Particularly when we're talking about really fundamentals. I think the idea of discretionary government is a very dangerous place at some level. Because it just leads to unfair government across the piece. Now, that might be in ways that don't matter so much. It might be in ways that really matter. And there's everything that we've all said about different instances of unfairness that we really have to confront and battle with. But yeah, I think the protection of law, for all its imperfections and how it's delivered, is an important thing to hold on to.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, that sort of tension that you've outlined, I think, is one that kind of really does run through. Where on the one hand, acknowledging the fact that the legal construct of the citizen is a product of the very border regimes that many of us as border abolitionists are aiming to abolish, and it will always be therefore malleable at the hands of the state and of government, and therefore it will always be unreliable. But on the other hand, the importance of citizenship as an arsenal, as a tool that we have, and as something that should potentially affirm not just entitlements, but also political obligations of everyone on that land in terms of democratic participation, but also in terms of the duties of the state, if you like, to citizens. I think it sounds a little bit to me like what we might think of as non-reformist reform, sort of analogous to that, where the wider concept at a macro level, the struggle is against borders, but at the same time, the struggle, I suppose, has to be for, at the very least, the state to do what the state says it's going to do. But these are really, really complex cases, and Richard as well, and Shamshir Baji as well in particular. I know that there's a lot of cases that you've both been linked up with and talking about that have quite different circumstances, but quite similar themes running through them. And so the next question that I want to ask is, how do these diverse cases of manipulation of the category of citizen relate to one another? Now that's a massive question, but if you can solve that for me quickly, Saskia, that'd be great. But thinking here to start with Windrush, right? That in and of itself could fill panels and panels of discussion. Added to that, Shamima Begum with the citizenship rescinded. Added to that, Nazanin's case, Jagtar Singh Johal's case, the attempted extradition of the West Midlands 3, the continued unlawful deportations. How do these cases or these instances relate to one another, and what must our response be as people on the left or as socialists? Richard, are you okay for me to come to you first?
Yeah, no, I'll have a go.
Yeah, go on, give it a go.
I think to pick up on the easy bit, which is sort of what are the commonalities and the common themes rather than the sort of more abstract stuff. I think if I look, one of the things that comes through in Nazanin's case quite often in the government's deflection strategies is a real use of the concept of dual national. And the concepts of kind of implying, okay, well, there's British and there's brown British, effectively. There's we've got someone that, okay, yes, she's got a passport, she's entitled, but she shouldn't have gone there. She shouldn't have done that. She shouldn't, and I mean, in fairness, government protection is discretionary, and different reasons will be given in different cases. If you're not a dual national, if you're white working class, a different reason will be given. But if it can be deployed, it will be deployed. And it does, mud does stick. There's a lot of kind of victim blaming that you see in many of these cases. Then as to it's their own fault really, and the government will do them a favour, but they shouldn't have been so stupid. And I think the other thing that I think Shashir said that just there is a dynamic often, and I've seen it in our case where we've had quite good press. I mean, generally it's in quite good-natured press, but also quite extensive press, more so compared to others, and more so compared to the other British Iranian families who were being held hostage. And that will partly be because I sound like someone on Radio 4. It will be as simple as that. But also, I mean, I do remember particularly, my little daughter once did an interview with the Times, and she was put on the front page because it was such a rare thing. And next to there was her picture on the front page, and next to it was Shamima Begum's picture. And it really was, good dual national case, bad dual national, and it was just before Shamima had lost her baby. And that kind of, if the point that you were saying about proving loyalty and just contingent belonging, fragility of citizenship, it's there. I probably sit here as someone that it's not contingent for me in the same way. I don't have to prove myself, and there was a whole reality check disbelief that I mean, I remember meeting the minister for the very first time, and him saying, "Listen, I have lots of cases that come through my door. It's nice to meet someone that's really British." And it's like, God, I can't believe you said that out loud. I mean, that
Who was that?
It wouldn't be fair to say, or legally prudent, but there we go. But I take it back to that point of discretion. When government is discretionary, in fairness, that is the legal framework, and they're doing you a favour. Don't be surprised if also you have to act grateful for every favour you get.
That's a lot to think about there. Shamsher Baji, did you want to come in on that?
That's okay, thank you. Yeah, so even though we've kind of crossed borders, we haven't arrived here whole. And when we're pursuing the space for wholeness, the land, that's what's subject to criminalization, that pursuit of wholeness, that pursuit of liberation. And we see it continually, with this discourse of this binary of the good, loyal, Sikh citizen or the bad, militant one that doesn't belong and that doesn't have any place here. We've seen it with Jaggi's case where, he was continuously...
I think maybe give an update on Jaggi's case because,
sure.
For the reasons Richard has spoken about, I don't think it's as well known.
Yeah, definitely. So the Jaggi's case emerges out of Jagtar Singh Johal, who's one of our friends, who's born in Scotland, in Dumbarton. His case emerges out of the context of the Sikh liberation struggle against India. And after colonization, after Punjab was annexed in 1849, between 1849 and 1947, there was a 100-year period of direct colonial rule. And then India emerges as this unified nation entity in 1947. And that's when we're kind of forced to exist in India as these fractured beings who are politically represented through the Akali Dal party, and religiously we're represented through the Shromani Gurdwara Parbandhak Committee, which is like a religious institution. So the wholeness that we had before of just existing and being and having our own indigenous ways of organizing and living, that was replaced with these institutions that were tied to the state. All of the pushback against that, all of that searching for that wholeness has been subject to, as I was saying, not only criminalization, but in India, genocide, massive levels of state violence where Sikhs have been, given when they've named their struggle for freedom, Khalistan, when they've been pursuing that freedom. So out of that, from the 80s to the mid-90s, for a decade, young individuals like myself, in particularly young Sikh men, were seen as, in this suspicious category of being, subversive and targets for elimination by the state. And this is something that the British instituted with, Criminal Tribes Act and, this whole category of the religious fundamentalist. And India continues all of that colonial logic. And, we fight a decade-long liberation struggle, and then that liberation struggle comes, the first kind of armed phase of that comes to a conclusion when it's met with greater state violence. So that, what Sikh, writers and thinkers have called, they call the peace in Punjab today the silence of the graveyard. So anybody who's resisting in this graveyard where there's this imposed silence which is maintained by omnipresent state terror is, a terrorist, is subversive. And Jagtar Singh Johal, who's been accused by the Indian government of radicalizing Sikhs online because he's been talking about Khalistan, he's been talking about Sikh liberation, he's been running a social media page and a website. So he was detained in India, and part of his campaign has been, continually kind of saying he was British born, because he looks, like now he does, because in prison he started wearing a turban, he started keeping his hair long. But so because he doesn't look like, what a British person is supposed to look like a white person, the whole narrative of the case has been he's been born in Britain, The same way with the West Midlands 3 that India tried to extradite in similar kind of circumstances of this narrative of, extremist activity and supporting Sikh liberation. That whole narrative has been that these guys are, British born, they're British born. And it's like we have to continually prove our loyalty in order to get rights and get the status of citizenship that's never really conferred to us. Like we're never really fully part of British society. And we are when we're hyper visible as, these model minority, as the loyal soldiers for empire. And in, today's day and age where, statues, that celebrate and honor colonialism are being pulled down, the Sikh community, I think, is the only community that's paid £100,000 to have a statue put up of themselves in service to empire, because this model minority logic is so pervasive and the trauma of colonization is so deep that we literally have to feel like we have to continually prove ourselves. And of course the Labour Party maintains this binary as well. It maintains this racism by engaging with Sikhs as a homogenous block of the whole community leader bullshit that passes off as representation. They don't speak to us as individual people with diverse political opinions and diverse positions on what it means to be British, what it means to engage with the state, whether it's here, whether it's in India. And of course, Britain loves India because, samosas and like the Indian summer, and it's a deep, really weird kind of fetishization. So they're never going to really, and also they need India now as a source of cheap labor. Because it's not like North America where they have Mexico, they can exploit right near them. So they have this weird relationship with India. So they need India, and they're not willing to, be critical, and they're not willing to challenge, the Indian state in any way, whether it's human rights violations, whether it's the numerous liberation struggles that are going on.
Yeah,
so,
Baji, I'm going to ask you to come in there actually, because there's also the context, of course, specifically with India, in terms of a lot of this is being filtered through trade, and similarly with Nazanin's case, right? Actually, the central focus for the British state is trade relations, right? And kind of British citizens that are being detained and tortured elsewhere are kind of bargaining chips within this. And so, with Jagtar's case, it's the fact that after Brexit, we need a good trade deal with India. So I think it's also really important to recognize that the malleability of citizenship as a category is predicated on kind of capitalist forces that are global, right? That we don't have any control over in that sense anyway. And similar with Nazanin, it's a hostage situation over money allegedly owed to Iran. And Fundamentally, it always does come down to money, as well as racism, because it's obviously the UK. Saskia, did you want to come in on some of these things and how these cases and Shamima Begum and Windrush and relate to one another, how we should react to them or relate to them?
Thanks, Amar, and thank you, Richard and Shamsa. I feel this is so much to talk about. I'm trying to make sure that I stay focused. How should we relate to them? I think it's a really difficult question and very easy to just be it's all about racism, but I do think it is all about racism. And the first thing I thought of when I saw your examples of the kinds of citizenship questions that you want us to think about, the first thing I thought was, where's Grenfell in that? And how even within the UK, these borders that exist are not just on the kind of legal, the mappable borders of the UK, but within our understanding of the country itself. And I'm sure everyone in this room has like paid a lot of attention to what happened at Grenfell and its aftermath, and the fact that a lot of the people who died are people of colour and also Irish people of Irish descent, and basically all of the people like who are seen as imperial subjects who have come over here and are like taking our resources, or as you say, you know, like these are people who came over here as a form of cheap labour for the British state and then had the audacity to stay. I also have been thinking a lot about kind of the idea of being left behind in the sort of idea of like the progressive nation state that is projecting itself forward into a future. And with this government is this glorious future of the kind of post-Brexit Empire 2.0, I think was the phrase they used around, I can't remember if it was the last election or about Brexit itself, which is like a really like chilling phrase to be using.
Can we get a cheer for Empire 2.0, please?
Yeah, and I'm sure, like, yeah, the idea of the white working class and the idea of being left behind and left out of this kind of, you know, phallic projection of Britain into the future, and this idea of if we're going to convince people to do this, then whiteness needs to pay. And I think I have lots of thoughts about the whole like red wall, blue wall thing, but I was thinking, I just wanted to talk a bit about how, you know, this idea that there's a group of people who have sort of been contaminated by not being white enough, and how can you bring them into that project of the nation by being like, it's not that, like, you shouldn't be in solidarity with working class people or people of colour, and many people of colour are working class in this country because of the ways in which our society is structured. So I think that, thinking about how all these citizenship battles are connected, as you say, Richard, having a Radio 4 voice makes your appeal so much more likely to be heard by the government and by our media, which is so biased towards a particular kind of citizen, or like you know, this imagined citizen. And one thing I guess I don't really agree with you is that we're in danger of ending up with rich man's law. I think this country has always been subject to rich man's law, and you know, the whole project of the media is to kind of keep people like dreaming the same dreams as the government, even if they don't reflect the reality of our social relationships like day to day. I think these are my musings. I hope that's
good musings, I reckon. Yeah, thanks. We'll go to Dahlia, and then I think we'll open it up a little bit.
Thank you. I think that the way that we deal with this, the way that we hold the contradiction that we understand that citizenship and bordering is such a devil's pact with the state, while also, you know, when it comes to it, those of us who have done, you know, I do casework with a union, and a lot of it is about trying to make claims to citizenship, or trying to make claims to, you know, settled status or whatever. You know, we do use these tools. And I think the key thing we need to do is, while having to, you know, make those claims, we have to be working to break the connection and break the attachments to citizenship as our model of belonging. Because the thing is that the concept of citizenship, the bureaucratization of belonging, is a form that comes with capitalism. It comes with, and you know, Nadine's book is just, you have to read it. It's just incredible. Talks about how citizenship is a way of essentially it's a tool of capitalism, because it is about gatekeeping and hoarding resources through spatial means, right? It's essentially a spatial kind of fix. And essentially, we need to understand that capitalism and the citizenship model that comes with it is a very juvenile ideology. It's a very short, and this is where like the using and the kind of like speaking to and with indigenous models of belonging, we have to understand that this isn't about going back. This is about actually understanding that these models are the resilient models that have survived crisis, ecological crisis, political crisis, in a way that has actually prioritized survival and the wholeness that we have spoken about today. Capitalism and citizenship is a very young, it's juvenile, it's young, it responds to crisis through expulsion, through continuing through its path of dispossession and its expulsion logic. And it is literally, and it's also juvenile in the sense that it's, literally destroying our home, everyone's home, which is, our ecology. So I think trying to, and the way that we can do that is actually through cases that reveal the contradictions of this category. Because the key here is that, yes, being a citizen, and particularly being a white citizen, does confer rights and visibility, but it's peanuts actually in comparison to what we could have. You have your Radio 4 voice, but your wife is still in prison, and that is the key thing. The passport is there to hoard the resources of colonialism and capitalism, but how much of that resource is, the white working class person actually seeing? So I think it's, actually, more than, an undocumented person for sure. But again, it's peanuts in comparison to the models of belonging and distribution that we could actually have. And using these cases to reveal these contradictions, I think, is the way that we can both sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think, it's also important to come to the idea that bordering doesn't just happen when you cross an international border. It can happen without ever having to cross it. This is the heart of social democracy. The heart of social democracy is that some people are included and some people's livelihoods are protected by the state to an extent, and others are criminalized. And I find actually here, we talk about anti-racism. I find disability studies incredibly inspiring here, because disability studies grapples with the idea of being part of the community but not being deemed productive, and what that confers to you, and coming up with other models of what it means to be in community with one another. So I think that breaking the social and cultural attachment to citizenship as something that will not protect you, even if you feel completely inhabited in it, and that there is so much more that can be had, is really, I think, the strategy that we need to employ.
I think, I found that so interesting on multiple levels, because so I know Saskia through organising back in the day with Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants, and that kind of sense of what community actually is, which is completely removed from these kind of structures. It was nowhere laid more bare than at LGS Migrants, because it also wasn't just a case of casework, from a very queer perspective, the kind of kinships that were being formed, the kind of mutual solidarity, and what we'd probably now call, I guess, mutual aid, since it's been co-opted by pandemic and all that. It really did kind of offer a glimpse at an alternative. And when you experience these relations that are kind of under threat from the state and under threat from kind of racialization and kind of contingent ideas of what citizenship is or should be, the whole thing just looks completely ridiculous and arbitrary and, just absolutely insane. And it's really, it gives you so much hope as well, but at the same time it's so stressful, because you're materially invested in trying to tear down these structures that you and your friends are having to make appeals to. Before we open up to questions, did anyone want to respond to what any of the other panelists had said? No? Well, I hope you've been paying attention, because I'm told that we have someone with a mic over there. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions that either they want to ask the panelists, or any kind of general comments that they'd like to make or contribute to the discussion? Put your hand up. We've got, is that Haroon? There's a mic coming. And I think if we can take maybe 3 at a time, and then,
Hi there, Haroon, I'm from Peckham. So I guess I had a question really about successionism. During the Scottish referendum, there was a sort of attempt to sort of hegemonize that with a left-wing, campaign, basically. How would you engage with these sorts of things? There's also discussion maybe of, like I say, a federal Britain, breaking up the UK. They're kind of a parallel to the Tories' version of, levelling up. Maybe is this idea of devolution and so on in the north. And so I just wanted to ask about that. How would you engage with those sorts of things?
So just to be clear, are you talking about specifically, like, I think what's colloquially been called like Lexit, and also kind of like devolution as ideas that are also still tied to kind of maybe some idea of nativism potentially? Is that what you're asking about? Okay, yeah. Cool. Have we got any more questions to take? Do you want to take a couple at a time? Just over there.
Thanks. Thanks to the panelists. They were very interesting comments. But it does seem to me there's a paradox here that's not really been adequately stated, and that is from the broader historical sweep, that the concept of citizenship has been associated with revolutionary periods in history. That goes right back from the earliest days of the formation of city-states to the early capitalist period with the French Revolution, to the anti-colonial period, and right the way through to the socialist revolutions as well. And it was strongly associated with egalitarianism as well, and redistribution and reform. On the other hand, during periods of revolutionary ebb, when the elites reassert themselves, then you get all the things that you've been talking about, the radical differentiation between different groups, never abandoning the concept of citizenship, but introducing ideas of differentiation, or colonialism and so on and so forth, make a comeback. If that is the position, if there is both a revolutionary dimension to the issue as well as a reactionary one, shouldn't we be thinking more strategically about the uses of citizenship rather than, as Richard was saying, throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Is there one more hand we can take?
Yeah, I was nearly late here because the bus from my campsite was delayed by 20 minutes because of people queuing at petrol stations, which is, it's a reflection of the fact that 3 million workers lost rights with Brexit, and amongst those were transport drivers. Now, apparently they're going to allow some transport drivers from the EU to have certain employment rights that they lost in order to solve this crisis. But the reason I mention that is that it seems to me that with globalization, the populations of developed countries anyway, like England, are being subdivided into levels of entitlement. I mean, it's reflected in the health service now, with one of the engines of privatization is stopping people, usually people of colour, from getting healthcare unless they can prove that they've got the citizenship right. So that there's multiple layers, and the lower layers are more exposed to exploitation in the labour market. And this isn't a new thing, obviously, but it's unfolding in the motherland, as it were, because of the loss of empire and the subsequent globalisation. So I wonder if the panel could address that. I mean, really, citizenship is a set of layers that are all about exclusion to aid the capitalist exploitation of labour. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank all three of you. So, some pretty simple questions here, I think, right? One about federalism, devolution, and kind of Brexit and the independence framing, and how kind of we might relate to that and its kind of implications for the concept of citizenship. Is that something that we can claim, or are there negative things that are implicated in the reclamation of those ideas. We've got another question, which is about the fact that citizenship and citizens has been associated with revolutionary potential and revolutionary moments in history as well. And isn't there therefore space to kind of expand the definition, to make it egalitarian, to make it something that is more inclusive? And then we've got another, in a similar vein, question, which is about how citizenship is a layered process, if you like, and how it's kind of, it's moved by globalization and the need for, I think there's a term called carceral cosmopolitanism, which is where countries in the global north facilitate increasingly contingent migration for the purposes of a reserve pool of labour, but would not give, in most cases, citizenship or naturalisation, precisely because the exploitability of that foreign labour source is what makes that migration possible or desirable to states in the global north in the first place. Who wants to start? Yep.
So just taking like a broad look at some of these questions, like I'm pro-liberation, right? Like regardless of who wants it. For me, I think liberation and individual sovereignty is absolutely essential. So as much of the power of the state that can be restricted, I think it's a great idea. We know like what the reality is, despite all of the, this historic conversation of like what citizenship is. When we encountered white people, when we encountered citizenship, it was always used as a tool of violence. You're either loyal to this country and you can come here and you can literally like live here and you can work here, or you're disloyal and you stay where you are and you're always going to be, that the pervasive racism of Britain, like which is in the air here, it always maintains those divisions. So for me, it's like we know the reality of these categories of citizenship and of human and this whole idea of like rights, right? Like that rights can be conferred. The Sikh community has long sought to be a model minority and pursue this conversation around human rights in order to gain something, back from the colonizers. We haven't got it back, and it's been a long time. Since we've been here, and we've been holding up this drumbeat of like, rights that should be conferred, and we're loyal and we're productive, and look how well we do, and we own homes and all the rest of it. Our material conditions haven't changed. The only thing that's changed is we've gone deeper into the model minority discourse in order to retain space for even this general conversation. So that human rights conversation, when we start speaking about why human rights are being violated, that's when we get into the territory of criminalization, of having our rights stripped away. Our human rights are violated because we want something that we're not allowed to have, which transcends this entire conversation of citizenship. We want our liberation. So when we pursue our liberation, then we're no longer human. Then we can be treated like migrants. We can be treated like, the rest of the undesirable scum. So, I think, I think people of color know the reality of these conversations, despite how they're kind of played out as discourse. They have very real implications on our sovereignty and our existence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that definitely resonates with me personally, but it is also a difficulty, I suppose, in terms of like a lot of the kind of texts that we look at for like revolutionary potential that come from like, a European Marxist tradition, like we'll talk about like citizenship as something that can be expanded and egalitarian, I suppose, precisely because like central to that is not anti-imperialism. Imperialism is often posited as being kind of an extension or a means by which kind of capitalism like propagates itself, but it is rarely centered in that conversation, which potentially, maybe I would argue, leads a disjuncture between emphasis on what is possible, the revolutionary potential of this concept, versus the violent realities that we face every day in the streets and in the courts. Who wants to come in next on any of these? Cool.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I suppose they all speak to the idea of I think, the idea of like devolving Britain, having like a more federal system, or like devolving into separate nations. I'm sure like people have seen the Northern Independence Party and have feelings about that. But I suppose I would argue that the trouble with any form of nationalism, so the trouble with Scottish nationalism, is that every nation or every nationalism ends up creating its own racialized exclusions. So I think Scotland is able, because foreign policy is Westminster's purview, is able to claim a more socialist, more egalitarian view of citizenship, which is actually not the case, because I think if it's like from what we've seen of like the many nations that were formed in the 20th century, that just because they are anti-colonial doesn't mean that they don't enact their own racialized exclusion. So I suppose I would query whether or not a more federal nation or a devolved nation would be any more likely to have a more redistributive attitude to resources, because it's all about, like, when you form a nation, you end up trying to hold on to those resources and not, like, it always, like, we've seen the pattern over and over again of different kinds of bordering that happen with that. And I suppose, the problem with citizenship is that it always gets tied to nationalism. So even in socialist examples, like, I don't think that, like, any socialist state that has existed has ever been one where it's kind of been like an abolished borders situation. So that was my thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone want to come in?
I think with the question about federalism and devolution and Brexit and stuff, I think I could be in favour of Scottish independence. I could be in favour of leaving the European Union as a way of essentially trying to weaken the infrastructures of empire. So, like, yay to Scottish independence because it's just going to generally weaken the British state. Or, don't lie, though. Do you know what I mean? Like that, like, don't lie and be like, Scottish nationalism is different. It's not, because it's just, so I think we just need to be real. And I think that is what the problem is when we lie to ourselves. What we need to do is we need to be very frank about the tools that we have at our disposal, their limitations, and how we make sure that we're sort of using them in a way that is aware. So the problem is when you start saying, this kind of nationalism is different. And I think when it comes to the uses of nationalism in anti-colonial or like in anti-colonial context, I think this is a really interesting question, because at the time when, during anti-colonial struggles, this was a controversial question. It wasn't always a given that the nation state form was the form that would be pursued, and especially, feminist writings and, working class writings and contributions to anti-colonial discourse warned against this and said we should be creating our own models, of how we want to have self-determination, how we want to have sovereignty. But eventually, I think that, the nation state, for many, it was a trade-off, and it was like, we have to become legible in this new global regime, and becoming legible in that global regime is to become a nation state and is to have passports and it's all of that. And I would say that has been a key limitation. It's a key limitation of why, yes, we achieved independence and all of this, but we still live under a neo-colonial state. We still live in neo-colonialism, and I think it's because we were never able to decouple from that nation-state form. And so essentially we entered a new, different regime where resources are still organised spatially in this way and still are, taken from one area to fill one other area. And, people are gate-kept, but it's just done, in a different way. And the retention of the nation-state is an essential way in which that has continued to exist.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, I think, to a great extent. And that point about legibility and the need to become legible in a world in which legibility is kind of the parameters of which are laid out by whiteness, right, as a kind of central construct. And that need for legibility, I'm thinking now at a much more kind of micro level, to bring it back to the Kruger report that Saskia was talking about earlier, which is over the pandemic, the government saw that mutual aid groups were springing up and mutual provision was springing up. And from this, in the most kind of reasonable, liberal, radical Tory way that it can be read, we get a report that ends up calling for a national volunteer reserve that can be utilised in times of crisis by the state, used to be given specific volunteer reserve passports, and that this kind of taxonomy of community organisers, if you like, can be atomised, directed, and directed quite specifically to shore up public participation in the criminal justice system. So even in kind of, on its own terms, like the kind of reasonable reading that government is able to do of kind of organising that happens at a local level of communities and kinship systems that are forming in times of crisis is to be, how can this be rendered productive to aid economic development and aid carceral violence? And so when Danny Kruger calls for a new social contract, and where he says that, you know, as conservatives, we've been missing out, like, the active citizen as the partner of business and the state, and when it's welcomed by many in, you know, the alternative economy sector, which I kind of am active in terms of writing and organising a little bit, it's welcomed as being like, oh, well, we're going to get some grant money from this new social covenant. The government is going to support us to kind of shore up our communities and strengthen our community bonds and bring back active citizenry. What does that active citizenry look like, Danny? Special magistrates and time off to do it. It's fucking risible and horrendous, and I don't know if I was meant to swear then, actually. Cut that from the video? Can we cut that? That was a little rant. Would you like to come in, Richard?
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks. These are really excellent questions, and I mean, I'm clearly beyond my competence in philosophising on most of it. I think all I would say, in terms of the panel, and you know, there's lots of legitimate sort of concerns about the dangers of citizenship as a concept, and you know, problematising the history of it, and I would agree with the question over here about, you know, the potential of citizenship, and also the future of it, and I don't mean that in a flippant soundbite way. I mean, like, there are trajectories at play here. The patterns of exploitation evolve and change. And we should be alive to them. And part of what we've been articulating are different things where, you know, clearly the world is getting more divided economically, and that has all sorts of consequences in lots of ways. There are spaces to do something with that. There are spaces where it just gets stretched too far. I think for me, and this is partly, you know, from talking about sort of the Iran experience, that there's a lot of sort of, I mean, you take Nazanin's story to bring back something I do know about. You know, our story is a story at some level of not quite colonial blowback, but historical legacy blowback of Britain's role in Britain's role in the Middle East, Britain trying to maintain that post-empire, selling arms secretly, doing sort of clever, dodgy deals that came back to haunt us, or came back to haunt our family anyway. And I think part of that is saying that, listen, history comes back to haunt you. You know, in ways that actually is you know, effaced from the sort of romanticised narrative of how we tell ourselves that, you know, in you know, the Spitfire Britain and so on. But also I think it's important to look at, you know, how is, I mean, Britain trying to earn its way in the world? How is it trying to sort of, you know, that sort of model of I mean, almost sort of led by the City of London and kind of, it's not quite the Victorian Britain. It's kind of a sort of a being a kind of a bankers to the world and lawyers to the world, and, you know, welcome all the kleptocrats to come and stay here, and it creates different challenges, different risks, different dynamics, you know, and actually there's a way in which, if I look at, say, Nazanin's case, Jaggie's case, other families where, you know, at a simple level, you know, the government is not acting and standing up for British citizens, not because it's got this sort of pompous view that you know, we want to be new Victorians again, but because it you know, literally wants to you know, get access to dodgy money and to come over here and doesn't want to offend the rich, powerful kleptocrats. Now, there's a, you know, it's a bit unfair on the Foreign Office. There's some very decent, kind people who would love to have Nazanin home and love to have Jaggie home and so on. But the decision making is driven by you know, an interest in a sense of where, you know, UK PLC, UK, you know, ruling decision maker. I mean, in that amorphous sense rather than sort of a narrow conspiracy. But you know, that I suppose that's what I mean by sort of looking forward. What's the world that we're living in, and where are there the spaces to work with the concepts that can hold power to account? There are some big concepts, but also, this week we went and knocked on the Prime Minister's door and sent my daughter up to do it. That's a very straightforward image, which is say, listen, it's your job to solve these problems, so get on with it.
Yeah, well said. I think what all of us here can kind of recognise for sure is that whatever the underpinnings of citizenship, whatever its failings or its perceived incapacity from some of us to become an inclusive space with any kind of revolutionary potential, despite the historical implications, at the same time, all of us are engaged in appealing to it, right? Whether it's with Nazanin's case, whether it's with the casework, whether it's with Lesbians and Gay Support the Migrants, whether it's with Jagtar Singh Johal, or with the West Midlands Three, and it was incredible news to get this week that the West Midlands Three will not be being extradited because there was absolutely no evidence on behalf of India. But so the critiques that we're levelling, I think, are so important. And I think it speaks volumes that the work that is involved to fight it, I don't want to say in and against because it's the first session in and there's too many cliches, but there's an element at which the critiques that we level for its lack of revolutionary potential don't absolve us from the need to engage with those constructs, because we can choose not to engage with the state, but the state will continuously engage violently with us. I think we'll probably leave it there. Can we have a round of applause for Shamima Singh, Saskia Papadakis, Dale Gabriel, and Richard Ratcliffe? Thank you so much, everyone, for giving up your morning and coming to join us here. We're really looking forward to seeing you around the rest of the festival. If you have any questions with regards to accessibility, where to get your wristbands, programs and all of that, pick someone in a TWT t-shirt like this one. Have a great couple of days. Looking forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you.